Coming at you live from RSA 2020. It's Paul's Security Weekly. That's right. We've got Gabriel Gums from Spirion will be here with us. We're interviewing one of our own hosts, Mr. Jeff Mann, to talk about the tales from a Crypt Analyst. Also, we are going to recap what we've learned at RSA, some of the interesting vendors we might have met out here, some of the interesting techniques we may have learned from our friends about how to do security better. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker.
Oh, wait. I now welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly.
Gotta love the live stream.
We do work on our queuing system, but not that kind of queuing system. I'm your host, Paul Astorian. This is episode 641 of Paul's Security Weekly. We're here. It says recorded on March 27th, 2020, which is obviously wrong because that would be in the future. I think it's February.
No, but that was that one vendor we saw, and they gave us the time machine. So,
that's right.
Yep. Which really is March 27th.
Yes. So,
it's actually February 27th.
Welcome, everyone. It is February 27th. Mr. Matt Alderman is here, not in studio. This is our remote studio here on Broadcast Alley
area.
Marconi West.
It's been fun to record shows live and watch the people walk by, and it's like, hi, friends, right? And so it's interesting to do a live show here. But I think you're a little upset because you don't have a cigar in your hand and there's not a drink in the other hand.
I had lots of cigars and drinks in my hands last night.
Yes.
I was even drinking them and smoking them. Well, smoking the cigars and drinking the drinks, not the other way around. It's important to get that right. You can get hurt. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us.
It's Mosconi, by the way.
What did I say, Marconi? I knew I said it wrong. I said Marconi.
It's
been a long conference.
It has the drinks, the cigars.
Yeah, the late nights, getting booted out of cigar bars. 3 of the 4 nights.
I left at 2, and you were still going strong.
Oh, they kicked us out.
Yeah,
they kicked us out at 2.
I bet. I left, I guess, a little bit before 2. But yeah, here I am, and I'm excited that you're finally actually going to talk to me and interview me.
Right.
But I'm really regretting that we don't have drinks and cigars in our hands right now.
I know. So, Mr. Scott Lyons is here with us.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Surprise appearance.
Well, being out here at RSA, it's a big infusion of tech advice, tech advance, right? A lot of new thought concepts, right? A lot of different insights from C-level execs. And
not as much blue hair as DEF CON.
No,
much.
but there is some.
But you're representing,
yes.
which I'm used to it now. I think it's
It's you.
It's you. Yeah, I agree.
So you're saying if I change this to like red or white or anything else,
it just matches your eyes.
Stop it, okay? I know you wanted to get that just on record so you can play it back later. Okay,
yeah.
I know your games.
We're gonna loop it. This is also 3/4 of the Security and Compliance Weekly host.
Right?
So
Right.
Welcome, Paul.
Welcome, Paul.
We outnumber you.
Compliance now. Surprise.
So what are your views on CMMC?
I feel I'm very mature. Oh wait, that's not what it's for.
No.
It's not PP maturity.
Right? So, Jeff, I just want to preface this with you're going to talk about what you can
absolutely
talk about.
Yep.
Obviously, if we need to edit anything out, is this going live?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's live stream, so we can't edit it out.
So we
don't
can't
worry.
edit it out. So
We're
don't
gonna
make
do
any
it live.
mistakes.
Do not violate
Okay.
your NDA.
Take your time answering, and obviously our audience will also be understanding that given Jeff's background, obviously there are things that can and cannot be talked about. So
Because they may or may not still be classified.
Be or
Right.
be not.
Right.
So-
There are things that I am sworn to take to the grave.
Yep.
There are things that I have no idea if they're still secret or not, but I'm going to err on the side of
Sure.
caution. And I will give you at some point one reveal. I do promise to reveal one of our primary cyber weapons that we used to use back in the day.
Sure.
Which at the time was technically classified top secret. And again, I don't know if it's technically been declassified. We'll see if the guys in the suits show up.
Right. Because they're listening,
Yes.
which is kind of funny because it's a public podcast, so like really anyone can listen.
Yeah,
so
right.
it's okay, right?
Pretty much.
So Jeff, I want to start with what years did you work for the NSA?
I worked there from the fall of 1986 to the fall of 1996. So I was there almost to the day, 10 years.
Gotcha.
Yep.
What led you to wanting to apply and ultimately becoming an NSA employee?
So I was a business major in college because that was like
The thing to do.
the degree that I found took the least amount of work, and I didn't have to take math class. My dad's was a physicist, and I avoided taking physics through my entire educational career. No particular reason. It seemed complicated and hard, and I didn't want
Unlike
to do it.
cryptography.
Well, yeah, we'll get there. But I had gotten a summer job as an intern before my senior year. My dad worked for a naval research institution. My mom worked for a different naval research institution in HR, and she was able to get me into an intern program, except for because of nepotism laws, I wasn't technically an intern, but they brought me in as a temporary employee. So I went on leave, and when I came home at Christmas for break, I went back and worked for a week, earned some money. And when I graduated, they put me back on, and at that point I was working for the technical library. I mean, it was a low-level, entry-level position, but it was paycheck and benefits and all that.
At the NSA.
No, this was still at this naval institution.
Okay. Yeah.
And my mom, being in HR, connected to other people that talk about hiring and whatnot, she had a friend whose daughter had applied and gotten a job at NSA and said, "Hey, NSA's hiring, son. Why don't you move on with your life and do something?
Do something.
Get out of the house. All that. Gentle nudges out of the nest." Back in those days, I want to say the form's called SR 71. I think they still use the same government application. Filled it out, mailed it in. Got a letter back at some point, and they invited me to come up to Fort Meade for a couple days of aptitude tests, skills tests of various different forms. This was during the Reagan administration, where there was a lot of money in the DoD, and they were hiring 100 people a week, literally, at NSA. And
This would technically be considered the Cold War period?
this is still the Cold War. And the push back then was to essentially outspend the Russians and bankrupt them, and that's how we won the Cold War. What was the slogan, Matt? You were alive back then.
I
It
was.
was like strength through defense, or defense.
Yeah,
something like that. Anyway, took the test, scored well. They offered me a job, so I went to work. In the first couple months I was there, I was waiting. Well, it took 8 or 9 months to get the initial background investigation.
I was going to say there was
There's
probably
a whole process. Yeah.
There's a process.
probably similar or many of the same components as today to pass through the screening test. They still, as with many agency jobs, they talk to your friends and family and then
Interview other people.
And they did that obviously back then as well.
Yeah, and you have to put down friends, families where you lived for like 10 or 15 years, and they used to people have. If you're from the middle of Iowa or Kansas, down the dirt road, your neighbor that lives 5 miles away, they would send people out there to knock on the doors and ask all sorts of questions.
Yep.
And
And that's
it
just
took
not
time.
that's just not like legend or fable. Like I've
No, that's real.
been interviewed by 3-letter government agencies
So have I.
for friends and family of mine.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, well, fast forward for a minute. Later on, I moved into a townhouse that was right outside of Fort Meade, and everybody on the row, 3/4 of the people in the neighborhood worked for the government in one way, shape, or form. So it was a pretty regular occurrence.
Yeah.
My wife was staying home, raising the kids, doing home daycare. So she was always home when the people knocked on the door, and she's like, "Which neighbor is it? Which government agency? Let's cut to the chase." She knew the drill at some point, and and all the housewives and stay-at-home moms were doing the same thing. So anyway,
So your first day at the NSA,
yep.
what was your can you talk about what your role was, or which division, what can you say about what you
So
did when you first got there?
the irony was, and I didn't really realize it until I got there, was they hired me, and this was a fairly common practice. They hired me without any specific job in mind. They just hired me because I scored well, and they were just flooding the agency with people. And so basically my first day on the job, while the last touches of the clearance were being gone through, which included psych evaluations, it included a physical checkup, pee in a cup type of thing, but also an actual physical. That's a whole other story for another day. Polygraph, had to pass a polygraph and all that kind of stuff.
It wouldn't be your last polygraph.
No. No. But I basically started going on job interviews, and
internally.
Yeah. They had people that would, there were a bunch of us, and we were all kept in sort of a holding pen. It was a technical library. We called it the Blue Lagoon, because the badge that you were issued with your interim secret clearance was blue, and when you got your full TSSI clearance, it was a green badge. So we just called it the Blue Lagoon. We were a bunch of blue badgers. Every once in a while, a bell would go off, and somebody would get their green badge, and there'd be celebrations that they walked out the door, and we never saw them again. So it was that kind of waiting game to who's going to be the last one out. So I went on a bunch of interviews, which I found out very quickly. They weren't interviewing me. It was more like sales pitches. Hey, we got a great job for you. Come and work for us. One of the first ones I went on was actually on what was known at the time as the InfoSec side of the house, and it was what was called the Manual Crypto Systems branch. And they were looking for someone to be a cryptographer to review all the different paper systems and manual systems that were still in existence, because they'd been sort of neglected for a few years, because with the advent of just technology and machines, especially machine cryptography, everybody assumed that paper would go away. And it didn't. It had actually proliferated. So they were looking for somebody to do a review. They had tried to attract a real crippy from the ops side of the house, and the best that they could do was get somebody that had been an intern years before rotating through that office to have him come back sort of as a loner and work there.
What was your background in cryptography up to this point?
Puzzles. I had no background. I grew up in a family that liked to do puzzles. I was looking for it the other day in one of the airports working out here. There used to be the Dell crossword puzzle book that would have crosswords, acrostics. Some are letters, some are numbers. Cross sums is another thing where you had to, just different kinds of puzzles. And I grew up with that, so I just like doing puzzles, and whatever made me like doing puzzles was the kind of stuff that gives you the good scores on the test. So, but I was fortunate that the guy that was their sort of loner, he became my mentor, and he's like sat me down and said, "Okay, who are all the different offices that you're talking to?" And most of them were over in ops. And he's like, "No, you don't want to work there." And it's like, "Actually, this place right here is actually pretty cool. You should try this." And so I did. So I went to work as a cryptologist, immediately took a bunch of classes. He was mentoring me.
Cryptologist and cryptographer.
Okay.
Crippy.
I throw the terms out interchangeably, and I apologize. So the science or the field is cryptology.
Cryptology. Like astronomy.
I have to stop and think. So a cryptanalyst is someone that's trying to break codes.
Okay.
A cryptology is the science, and a cryptographer, I believe,
is the one doing the
ciphers?
Develops encryption algorithms.
So I was doing cryptography.
But you were doing
initially.
paper.
Paper.
cryptography at this
Well,
point.
paper and, as it turned out, memory systems. One of my first assignments was to try to help a customer come up with a replacement memory system in case they had to drop all their one-time pads. It happened to be Special Forces. Their communications officer that they call the commo, he would carry like a 40, 50 pound pack of paper. That was his job, and he had one-time pads to write messages. One-time pads, you use them once, so every time you send a message, you got to throw it away, eat it, destroy it, whatever, burn it.
Is that why? Because it was literally a pad, like a
It was a pad of paper,
pad.
and
It was
the
literally a pad of
indentation,
paper.
right, is still there. So you got to get rid of the rest, so you can't see the other.
It's essentially a pad of key, and you use it once. That's why they call it a one-time pad. Destroy the key, nobody can rummage it out of the trash can or try to recreate it, and it's unbreakable. If you can protect the key so that nobody gets it and copies it, steals it, it's cryptographically unbreakable. It's the perfect method, and it's all been downhill since then.
Because we don't destroy them. We
don't
keep them
we
around.
don't destroy stuff, and we have to we like speed and everything to happen instantaneously.
So we
and
reuse the
try
same
to
key over
secure
and
it.
over and over again.
So that's so I started out doing paper and memory systems, and it was sort of the early days of the desktop, the IBM PC, and so one of my first jobs was the Special Forces, working on the memory crypto system. One of my other jobs was I was approached by somebody else that was a customer that was using one-time pads with people that they had recruited in the field, and the field might be on the other side of the Iron Curtain, let's say. The one-time pads that they had were literally the size of the heel of your shoe, because guess what? That's where they typically hid them. They were.
I'm sorry, Jeff. For our younger audience, the Iron Curtain.
Good point. During the Cold War, and what is the Cold War? Back when Russia used to be the Soviet Union, and they were spreading communism all throughout the world. That was sort of the big enemy of the United States.
Forcing. Yeah.
Spreading, forcing. They had expansionistic ideologies,
conquering.
Yes.
And the Cold War, the unspoken war, the war that was fought not on a battlefield, that was very much clandestine, cloak and dagger positioning, disinformation. I say fake news?
You mean cyber war?
Yeah, it's without the cyber,
Without the
cyber, yeah.
or swords, or
there
weapons.
There were some early.
There were certainly
Yes.
fatalities, and there were certainly skirmishes and things happening.
And there were computers involved in.
and there were absolutely
Sure.
computers
Yeah.
involved, but they weren't. Everybody didn't have access to
Yeah,
a PC. I mean, there were mainframes. There was even the internet. We didn't think of it like that back then.
Right.
But so the Iron Curtain was a term that was referred to as, I forget who said it, was like Churchill or something, or Truman. Somebody back in the 50s said that the Soviet Union is hiding behind a curtain of iron, and so the Iron Curtain became sort of the DMZ, the demarcation point between Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, and the free Western Europe. So that's Iron Curtain. So this particular customer, the case handler that was working with these recruited people that were sharing information, they're spies. He had a larger version of a one-time pad. It was sort of like tablets, like a legal tablet size, but half the width. For whatever reason, but they were complaining that it takes hours to decrypt and encrypt these messages one letter at a time. But there's this PC sitting on the desk. Is there some way that we could use that? And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. We should be able to write a program that does essentially the algorithm. And and I went and tried to find out, is there some way that we can, instead of printing the key on paper, can we put it on a floppy disk? And so everybody said, yeah, that makes sense. So I essentially became a project manager all of a sudden and developed this system where I found somebody that was a programmer that could write the code. I think they did Turbo Pascal.
I used Turbo Pascal when I was in high school. That was one of my classes.
So they wrote a program, and and I found the people that produced the key and figured out how to, requisition it to be put on floppy disks. And of course, the big concern is how do you do one-time key when it's on a floppy disk? So we had to, I went and found out, what the sort of the criteria was for building crypto systems, which was in those days written in respect to hardware, because there was no such thing as software back then. Everything was little black boxes. And it was called the Functional Security Requirement Specification, FSRS. So somewhere in there was talking about the secure deletion of key, and it said, well, you have to use a secure deletion algorithm. I said, okay, cool. So I went and started asking around, okay, where do I find the secure encryption, decryption, or deletion algorithm? They're like, well, there is none. So I found out I had to kind of make it up and figure it out. We think of things like, the overwrite and, was it Schneier had a little freeware tool? It used to be called a race, or at least Schneier had a formula for overwriting. That became secure deletion.
Have to do it
that was one of the options.
There was a 7-time kind of wipe over
with different
zeros and ones to.
Well, it was essentially every character that in binary would represent 8-bit ASCII characters. The characters that would represent a 0 and 1 in every bit space 7 times, something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, we had to write something. I don't remember what it was, but we came up with this thing. I had to essentially pitch the project before, essentially the senior level board members of the InfoSec side of the agency, a bunch of old guys with suits and pocket protectors and love to use slide rules, real smart guys, engineers, mostly mathematicians.
Propeller, is that what's from propeller head?
Sure, let's call them that.
Not really. Yes.
But they were kind of like, well, this has never been done before. We don't know what we like about it. So they gave me feedback in terms of, well, go off and do these 20 things and then come back and talk to us. I went off and did the 20 things, came back, and they said, well, you kind of met all of our criteria, but so we kind of have to let you go. So the main guy, who was like a equivalent of a senior VP, he said, all right, we're going to let you do this, but don't ever do this again. To my knowledge, this is the first time a software-based crypto system was produced by NSA. And all it was the guys were still using the paper pad in the field, but the guys that were in a comfortable office, secure office, a SCIF, they got to use the computer program. So we went out and distributed the one-time pads and the one-time pad floppy disks in the program.
So then the floppy disk had the key.
Yep.
You put in the computer. That would be the seed.
Yep.
You would decrypt the text.
There is no seed. So it's hard to do this without a visual. And maybe we'll have
Agreed.
to.
Yeah,
we can.
But
we're not in the studio.
We're not in the
studio.
The key's part of the algorithm that helps to decipher the message.
Are the characters that are printed on the page, and you write your message out one character at a time over or under the characters that are printed there. They're done in 5 character groups.
No, okay.
It's because very often these messages were transmitted by Morse code in bursts. So 5 characters at a time was the magic number of what you can remember when you're hearing it and write it down and all that. So, and then you have some sort of algorithm, which is usually something that you do in your head, or sometimes there is like a table that you would like row and column. Here's the plain text, here's the cipher or the key, and the third letter becomes the cipher.
Right.
And you
Is it
write
usually
that
in
out.
a wheel? We have a wheel, right?
This is the wheel.
Right.
This is the wheel that I'm talking about. The wheel was a way of doing that 3-letter combination thing, and it works in reverse. So the person on the other end's got the cipher, the same key, gets them back to the plain text. So it's unique 3-letter combinations.
Right.
Okay. Hard to do it without the visual.
Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, that was produced first time it had ever been done, and that was just the first couple years that I was at the agency doing stuff like that. The wheel, I called it the semi-automated one-time pad system, and then I moved on and became an intern. I was talking to some people.
An intern again?
Yeah. And when I was an intern, I'm sort of fast forwarding here because you want to talk about my last part ultimately. When I was an intern, I became a cryptanalysis intern, so I was over on the ops side, and then I was starting to learn how to break codes. And I went to different offices that were focused on, let's say, different areas of the world.
So when you started at different offices and areas, you were the intern when you first started?
Right,
Is that what,
right.
yeah.
And I would go in, and you know, like any typical intern, you're sort of given the low end stuff to do. You know, just sort of ease you into it. But you know, each office is supposed to be giving you a diversity of experience, either by you know the types of cryptanalytic challenges you were being faced, you know, based on the different geography and the different people or organizations or nation states that we were interested in. Not that we were interested, you know, that's what NSA does. You know, NSA is the listening post and the intercept of communications. A lot of the communications back then, it was signals intelligence, so they're capturing the communications that are in the air. You know, mostly on radio frequency waves of, you know, various degrees. I'm not an electronic engineer.
Yeah.
You know, ultra high frequency.
They're looking at
very
different
high
frequency bands and
you know, so one of my diversity tours was in a programming shop. One of the requirements to get through the intern program was you had to write a computer program that was used to do some sort of statistical or cryptographic analysis of what we called traffic. What we collectively called traffic. And at the
traffic
time,
isn't like what we think of today as TCP IP traffic. Traffic is any
No.
signals that are collected through
but
signals
I mean, it's
intelligence,
still
right?
signals.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
signals.
you know, it's all zeros and ones or something along. I mean, and sometimes it was analog in those days.
It's all just a series of tubes. I mean, never mind.
But what was interesting at the time when I first started working over there, NSA had their own mainframes. You know, we were running on Cray supercomputers, which were the screaming fast machines of their day, which now there's one in the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade. If
I think
if
it's
you
the
ever go
bench
there.
that you sit on when you
That was part of the computer. It
Yeah,
was
I
like
know.
it was like this
I
contemporary.
always wanted one that
modernistic
was a couch that I
Yeah.
could use as a couch, right?
But
'Cause it
I
looked like
think
a couch.
the advertising for it, they actually had somebody sitting on it. I think
so,
you
too.
really
Yeah.
could sit on it. But NSA had its own proprietary operating system that they had written for the supercomputers, as well as a programming language that was just basically written to do number crunching, statistical analysis, and that's kind of all it did. And you know, about this time is when Unix workstations were becoming popular. You know, the old Spark 5, 10s, the pizza boxes we called them. You know, so all the IBM PCs were being replaced by Unix workstations that now were plugging into a network. You know, so we have
coax probably back then.
Yeah, it was coax.
Yeah.
So the operating system had to be upgraded, and the programming language had to be upgraded. So this particular shop was taking all the programs that had been written in the proprietary language, which I've seen it in you know, Google searches, so it's public knowledge. It was called IMP, and everything basically was being converted to C programs. So I learned C programming, and I wrote, you know, I picked some you know, program that did something, and I had to rewrite it in C, and it worked in a very small sample set, and then I threw real numbers at it, and it immediately crapped out. I'm like, okay, logic error. I had to learn about pointers and indirect pointers and all that kind of stuff. And
You're not the only one that wrote software and had it crash
Right,
when you
right.
tested it.
I mean, it compiled, so it's
It's
going
a
to work,
age-old
right?
problem.
It compiled.
Yeah,
Let's
right.
push it out.
Let's do it.
Didn't you recently find a machine that was running for like days and days and days and days and days?
I did.
Wow.
I did. And it was running largely my software too, which is pretty amazing, actually, when you think about that. Anyway.
So anyway, I was doing the cryptanalysis intern thing. My last tour was back on the InfoSec side of the house. Only this time I was in an office called Fielded Systems Evaluations, and that office was responsible for going out and looking at how NSA systems were being used in the field, because somebody, which I thought was brilliant, had figured out, well, gee, the way that we are very often exploiting our adversaries' communications is we take advantage of the fact that they don't use them correctly. They don't change default settings. They reuse passwords or key phrases or the keys. You know, the one-time pad, instead of using a page once, they use it for a week or a month to conserve paper or whatever. So, you know, user misuse, shortcuts, bypasses, logic errors, default settings. Does any of this sound familiar to you?
Yeah, right.
You know, these things we were encountering back then, and somebody said, well, gee, if you know, our adversaries are doing things wrong, how do we know our people are doing things wrong? So we would go out into the field and look at how people were using it and observe. Because, you know, a lot of times communications officers, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, they just want to get the message out. And if they can make their job easier, like by simplifying and finding a quicker path that bypasses the crypto, because, you know, lo and behold, even back then, it was a pain in the ass to have to put in the key and do extra steps and slow you down, you know, whether it was a one-time pad or whether it was some sort of machine crypto system. You know, crypto slows things down. Security slows things down. And, you know, so we would evaluate whether there was bypasses or shortcuts or misuse.
But back up, earlier you said that that you had noticed and others had noticed that when you go and look at your adversaries that finding vulnerabilities, does that mean there was offensive cyber operations happening back then?
Well, so none of this is what I would consider to be cyber. This is all people using phones and radios and telegraph equipment. I mean, a lot of times the signal traffic is voice over radio.
Right.
A lot of it was analog back in
So
the
it
day.
was signals intelligence that was...
It was much more signals
looking
intelligence.
at collecting intelligence, right, over signals, but almost exploiting some of the weaknesses in the way that they were transmitting.
I used to
those
describe
signals.
NSA as it's the nation's big ear. It's listening, and whatever it can hear, and the ways that it hears, that's when we start veering into things I'm not going to talk about. You know,
Right, sure.
You know,
That's those are the secrets for reasons, right?
Sound is a wave, and it's out there, and you know, there's so much more of it these days. I don't know how we navigate through it, but
Frequencies.
don't think computers, think radios.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then you were tasked with, well, if we notice our adversaries misusing the way they're supposed to transmit signals,
right.
maybe we're doing the same kind of stuff. Let's go make
Exactly.
sure that we're not making those same mistakes. Okay.
Right, because NSA was the only game in town. They were the only producers of cryptographic equipment that was used by the armed forces, the military, State Department, and you know, they designed the best. It had rigorous testing to, you know, make and you know, calculations of how long is this good for. You know, is this equipment going to protect the data that it transmits for a year, 5 years, 20 years, 100 years, based on what the requirement is. You know, there's some secrets that have to be kept secret forever. I've told you guys the story, you know, real quickly. The Enigma machine, it was broken back in like the early 40s. When I went to work for NSA in 1986, the fact that it had been broken was still a secret. It was only declassified and revealed to the public that the Enigma machine had been broken. I want to say it was either in 88 or 89. The reason why that happened was it was still being used. So from an operational intelligence, keeping the secret that the thing had been broken a secret for so long, you know, that was a good 40, 45 years. That just doesn't, that's unprecedented. That doesn't happen anymore. Or maybe it does. That's where top secret stuff comes in.
Right.
So anyway, one of the branches in that office was looking at networked systems. That's what we called it back then. And I sort of gravitated to that because, you know, computers were new and interesting. And shortly after I arrived there, you know, the day that changed history, the release of Mosaic, which, you know, introduced the public to the internet and the World Wide Web, and everybody's trying to get on, and everybody's trying to figure out, ooh, this is this new thing. The
We're all
world is
dialing
now
up
connected.
through our AOL connections.
Yeah. So I was like, you know, that was cool. I was, you know, late 20s, I guess. What year are we up to now? Let's say I was in my early 30s. And, you know, that's just, you know, it just seemed like it was cool and neat. And, you know, I'd seen the movie War Games, and that was cool and neat. And I'd
Apparently
seen the
so
movie
did
Sneakers.
so did President Reagan.
Yep.
And there was there Air Force kind of, the book Dark Territory talks about the formation of what we're about to talk about.
Right.
There was some kind of influence from other branches of the military, including the Air Force. Is that?
Yep. The Air Force was a big player. But, you know, so what started out as network systems, there was a couple guys that got together, and we were like, hey, let's become hackers. Let's learn how to break into stuff. Let's break into our networks. We were all using network systems at that point. So we started learning how to hack each other, first our workstations and then the network. And this is classic TCP IP, all Unix based. Unix was closed source back then. Nobody had source code except for we did, which was kind of cool at the time. Linux hadn't been invented yet. Nmap hadn't been invented yet. In fact, the TCP or IP
Stack.
scanner that we used was a tool called Strobe,
Yeah, remember Strobe?
which was written by
Dan Farmer, right?
Julian Assange.
Oh, Julian Assange, that's right.
So, and Satan came out, Dan
Yeah.
Farmer and Vitsa Venema. We started using that. And, so we just started learning how to hack and break things.
Which very little, I mean, it was Telnet, right?
It was mostly Telnet.
Mostly
yeah.
Telnet. It was mostly our services were being abused, which
Yep.
basically allowed you to connect and log into and run programs on other computer systems without authentication or authorization, which we would call a remote code exploit today.
Right.
It
Well,
was
it-
it was more of a feature back then because we were very trusting.
And it wasn't so much. Well, yeah, you just said the word. It wasn't so much the lack of authorization. It was the trust relationships that were built in.
Right.
The way.
Yeah, you're right. You could apply.
I mean, it was
yeah.
in the early days, you had a workstation that was on a network, and your account was tied to that workstation. And I'm not going to remember all the terminology, but at some point, it became possible to sit down at any workstation
Right.
on the network and type in your credentials, and that meant the passwords and the authentication was being shared across the network. And of course, for convenience, you could put things in your profile that made it so you didn't have to type in your password.
Floating
And-
profiles.
NIS? Was it
NIS,
NIS
yeah.
was
Yeah.
the technology. that did
NIS.
that.
Yeah.
Yellow pages.
Yeah.
Everybody that was on the network was listed in yellow pages. For people that don't remember, is what we used to call the phone book. But Yellow Pages was the business listing, and so I don't know why it was Yellow Pages but not White Pages, but it was YP. So there
We
were
take for granted that, like, on my Android phone, I can open up my phone and just start typing a name, and
Right.
it
And
looks
it
up
just
the number
shows up,
for
yeah.
me.
Right.
It's-
So originally there's 4 guys of us, and we started. First we were breaking into our own network. We rewrote a technical paper on how to break into our own network, and described a lot of techniques, and submitted it for a technical writing award. There was an annual technical writing award, and we actually won. So we were sort of established, and we were talking about it was Telnet back then. It was clear protocols. Network sniffing was a thing. Of course, the network sniffers that we had were like 40, 50-pound appliances that were wheeled around on carts, and you had to plug it into the network router on a spare port, usually coax.
Right. Yeah.
So, network,
little BNC
network
connectors.
sniffing was a
Yeah.
little bit more complicated
Yeah,
back in
yeah,
those
yeah.
days. And then,
So did you carry the moniker of the Pit at this point yet, or were
not yet.
very-
So, management got wind of, hey, the world's changing, more focus is on the internet and the World Wide Web. So they did what any good bureaucratic institution does. They reorganized. And so they pulled together the best and brightest and formed a group called the Systems and Network Attack Center. And it was advertised as being a think tank and the first sort of quasi-public but NSA produced what do they call it, the Center of Excellence. And the vision by the deputy director who ran InfoSec at the time was to get a bunch of people together and just if we got more or less an exact quote, if we got 20 or 30 of those kids together, those long-haired weird hacker kids together, we can change the world. They can find all the vulnerabilities. They can figure out all the problems with all the operating systems, and we'll just be out in front of everybody. And of course, we'd been doing it for a while. It's like there's no way 4 or 40 or 400 people are competing against everybody on the internet.
Right.
So we thought it was naive and whatever, but that's what management had decided to do. So we were reorganized, kept together, put in a new office, in a new building, in a new area. And when we moved in, we was like, okay, we're going to build the hacker culture within our office. So we came up with a nickname for the office, and we called it the Pit. So that's the origin of the Pit.
Is that name derived from the physical location of where it was in the building?
No, when we were sitting around trying to figure out what we should call our office, somebody said we should do something like the old TV show MASH, where their tent, they called it the Swamp. But we didn't want to just say the Swamp. So somebody said Pit, it stuck. So we just, it was called the Pit. We weren't the Pit. Our office was the Pit.
Gotcha.
Okay. So if you want to fast forward,
Well,
you just read the chapter.
Well, just for our audience, I'm listening to a book on the way to RSA, and even before they mentioned the word, I'm like, they're gonna say the Pit, and then I realized that I had not heard anyone talk about that in a written or podcasting publication,
Right.
maybe outside of the show, like other than talking to friends that I know that told me, like, hey, this is where I worked, and we call it the Pit. And those
Right.
are Jeff Mann and Ron Gulo.
Right.
But really the only two people that I knew as sources that could definitively talk about and say that they worked in the Pit, and that's where I heard it from.
Right.
Now I'm hearing it in a book, and I was like, whoa, that's never happened
That's
before.
how we felt.
Right?
I mean, Ron was the first person to get the book, and I got a text one day with a photo attachment. He'd taken a picture of the couple pages, and he's
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God, we're in a book!" And he sent it out to. I mean, we still keep in touch, all the original members of the Pit, and it was like, "Wow, we got our 10 minutes of fame. We're in a book," but also it's like, "Wow, I mean, somehow
Somehow somebody
what
allowed
we
that
did
to come out.
it became legend. It stuck long.
Somehow it
It
got
stuck
out.
enough that it ended up in a book.
Like, again, I had never seen it in a publication. I
Right.
had only heard about it by conversing with people.
Right.
So it was pretty interesting that
Right, and
someone did their homework.
someone did their homework, and the author of the book, Frank Kaplan, I believe is his name. Did a lot of open source research and connecting the dots, pulling things together from all sorts of different sources. And I probably shouldn't say how accurate or inaccurate, and I've only ever read the one chapter.
Yeah,
I haven't read the whole book yet, but there's a lot in there that's right, and I don't think I'm revealing any secrets, because what we were doing was not secret in the sense that we couldn't talk about it.
What you did in it was
what we did was, but what we were focused on was not.
the secret. But I think as our audience knows, been listening to a lot of books and going back to the folks that I know and my friends in InfoSec that worked in those areas, and asking them to validate that what is in these books, is it really, like, how much is true?
Right.
My basic assessment and again, back to Jeff's point, when I press some of my friends on this, they're like, I can't tell you how accurate or inaccurate it is, right? I just get maybe some hints and clues based on what it is. My assessment is that the books are pretty good. They're probably 90% accurate. 10% is kind of like up for debate, or there's a smaller percentage where, like, basically and not this book in particular, some of it is like, that never happened that way, right? But that's the rare,
because it creates a
case.
little drama.
Yeah,
Well,
it could be drama.
And
could
I'll
be
give you
whatever,
an example. The book accurately and correctly describes the geographic location of where the Pit was located.
well, that's an interesting point in the book, because they do, if you're reading it and believing everything you're reading, you're like, wow, they give a really accurate description of the geographic location in the building.
And yet they said it was located near the airport south of Baltimore called Friendship Airport. And I'm like, that used to be the name of BWI, or now Thurgood Marshall Airport, but the name changed like back in the 70s. So while they had the airport right, they didn't use the right name.
Current name.
However, that area, which had quite a few NSA buildings at that time, was known as Friendship Annex. And so the abbreviation for that was FANX, and so we called it FANX. So there was a FANX 1 building, a FANX 2 building, a FANX 3 building, and so on and so forth. So my guess is, the author wanted to underscore the fact that he knew that the buildings were called FANX, Friendship Annex, and he just didn't bother to, but it's BWI Airport.
Right.
And then, his description of the Pit being this, dark chamber that had nobody knew it existed and had double sets of doors. That's a little bit Hollywood.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it was an office. I mean, it was
right.
it was a government office, and with a
Unmarked.
locked door. I think we had a keypad, button, 4 or 5 buttons, so there was a code to get into the office, and that was it. And then it was an office; it was desks and cubicles.
Right. Yeah.
And we actually there was one day where they had an NSA day, family day, and I was able to bring my family in. And it happened to be they got to see the pit, so all of my family has seen the
wow,
pit,
that's really cool.
and they were like, "This is it."
This is it.
It sounds really cool to us, right?
It
Like,
sounds
to them,
cool, but I'm like,
If you stood in one office,
you sit in that chair.
You've seen one office, you've seen them all, right? Like there's nothing. Yeah.
I mean, if you've been to an office that has cubicles, with the overhead, shelf with the fold up thing and its burlap cover so you can pin stuff on
Right.
it. I mean,
It's an office.
it's just an office.
Quickly before we have to close out this segment, and we'll do
And there's
more.
we
There's
need
a lot
part.
more to the.
We need a part 2, and the part 2 really needs to be done with
In
drinks
studio.
and cigars
Okay.
in the studio.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. What I appreciated was and I think I had heard probably more about the Operation Eligible Receiver than anything that transpired before that in this kind of storyline, right?
Right.
And I had always kind of heard it as there was, as people were doing red teaming activities, we wondered what was the security like in other areas of the military and U.S. government. And it was not very secure in the beginning, but no one was, right? So I don't think it came as any surprise. And the book describes that there were 25, this is what the book said, there were 25 penetration testers from the NSA that tested other areas of the U.S. government. Obviously, from what I understand today, this is obviously commonplace, right, to test various aspects of the offices in the U.S. government and military. But back then, this was kind of a new thing from the way I understood it.
It was a new thing. Eligible receiver was sort of the first public, at least within the community that cares about it. But it was the first NSA coordinated pen test or hack of the armed forces.
Right.
And it actually happened after I left, and we were doing the pit thing 4 years before Eligible Receiver happened.
Sure.
Which I don't know if it was mentioned in the book or not.
I don't think it was that precise on the timeline.
Again, Eligible Receiver was management's idea, not us peons that were just trying to change the world and do cool
You were
things.
tasked by someone above.
Yeah.
Well, no, Jeff wasn't. Someone else
Well,
was.
somebody else was because he was gone.
He was
Yeah.
gone, yeah.
So, the eligible receiver story again, because it was controlled and suits got in the way or had to manage it. It had to be their idea.
Yeah.
It was originally designed to be like a 2 or 3 week test, and they had to call it after 3 or 4 days because they had owned everything. And somebody like on a naval vessel finally noticed something, and they went to DEFCON 4. 4, 3, 2, 1, you're starting to shoot the nukes. Okay. So
We've all seen war games where they explain the whole.
We know.
Right.
So
Been there.
So they're like, okay, time out.
Yeah.
This is an exercise. So what was they were giving them like 3 weeks to see what they could do, and they did it all within a matter of hours and days. And so that was like, it was an eye opener. Things are insecure. I was like, well, yeah, that's the public suit version, but there was people, a small group of us initially, at least as pen testers. There was a whole organization that was formed 3 years before Eligible Receiver, 2-3 years before Eligible Receiver, that was focused on network security and research and how do you secure operating systems, how do you secure network protocols, and so on and so forth. So that was happening. Mix in a little bit of Clipper chip and mix in a little bit
we
of
even talk about that,
PGP is gonna.
Yep.
Is that when the Rainbow books were built?
The first Rainbow book, the Orange book, came out, I want to say, in the 80s.
Oh, okay. So way back then.
sooner.
Because again, there were network systems. Long
there were
before
communication systems.
There was
before.
the internet that
Right.
we knew about. Right. So more to the story, and it gets a little bit ugly, and at some future point we can do part 2 and talk about why I'm not at NSA anymore.
Yeah. I like to leave it at that and leave a teaser for part 2. So Jeff, thank you very much. Without, take a short break and come back with Gabriel Gums. Stay tuned.